I now have the pleasure of inviting to the stage and having the pleasure to moderate that myself, a panel of 3 great women that are going to sort of set the scene for the coming 2 days. First, I would like to introduce to the stage Julia Gillard. She's chair of Global Institute for Women's Leadership. She was the Prime Minister of Australia, 2010 to 2013. She is the member of the Council of Women World Leaders that are with us here today and have been working a lot with us, WPL that is, and chair of the Board of Directors of Global Partnership for Education. I know that every feminist in the world knows her well, Julia Gillard. And then we have one of our excellent co-chairs, Gita Gopinath, Chief Economist of the IMF. She's a professor of international studies and economics at Harvard University, and as I said earlier, co-chair of the forum. Please, Gita. And last but not least, one of our great members of the business community. We all know that women are far too few when it comes to being sort of on the stage of the international scene of companies. Jacqueline is one of them, member of the board of the management of Allianz SE. Please, Jacqueline, the floor is yours. And dear friends, we are going to do this as in line with everything we do here, fairly informal, meaning that I will try and make sure that they tell us something that they aren't talking about every day and make sure that we are informed on how best to sort of travel around in the world today when you are a woman leader. But the theme of this panel was to set the scene. What we now want to do is try and understand the global challenges that leaders today are facing, and especially women leaders that we all know are faced with different challenges, not only because they are fewer by the table, but also because they have been there for not as long time as the guys have. So I would really like to start just sort of on a general note. I mean, I'm starting with you, Julia. You wrote this amazing book about your sort of life story and the challenges you met. How do you see it today? What are the challenges facing women leaders today? What is the most obvious, and how sort of is the scene at the global stage when it comes to women leaders?
Well, for me, it really comes down to 2 words, and I use the words structures and stereotypes. I think we've moved beyond the conversation about what more do women need to do. I think women are doing the things that they need to do. But what we are finding is that the structures still do not create equal career paths and equal opportunities for leadership for women. So I do think whether it's business, whether it's politics, whether it's the law, the news media, technology, we've actually got to look at the structures and re-engineer them so that they are more inclusive. And stereotypes, because whilst a lot has changed for how people perceive women, I was drawn to an opinion poll in the 1940s, and back then, when asked the question, are men and women equally intelligent, only 35% of people said yes. So we've changed a lot in terms of, you know, how men and women are perceived in their ability to make a contribution. But we still have very strong stereotypes when it comes to leadership, you know, and those stereotypes tend to be historically based on male attributes, male styles of leadership, and we are stereotyping what women can do, and we've got to bust through those as well. So structures and stereotypes, I think, are the big challenges in front of us.
Thank you. I'm thinking about the business community. I mean, we're seeing figures definitely like, the biggest companies in the world, the largest one, we are seeing 5% of the CEO being women. I mean, is there something changing, like that you can see changing in the environment of the business, sort of the surrounding that is changing now? Will we see any moving from these awful figures?
I think we are facing a time of unprecedented change. And I think if you look back at when I started working, say, 20 years ago, I think leaders thought that their role in a commercial enterprise was rather focused on the internal machinations and how it interacted with their customers, that it was very much about managing your own business. But now if you look at the world we live in and you look at whether it's on the social side, on the technological side, the economic, the environmental, or the political side, we're seeing a degree of change that I certainly think is unprecedented. And we can talk a few about some of the things that are driving that. I think that does two things. I mean, that creates opportunities. I think that certainly creates opportunities for women to position themselves as part of the structures, to position themselves as part of the response to these changes. I think it also creates risk. And I think it's really environments like this where we talk about what is it going to be from a leadership perspective. Mm-hmm. Are we going to seize these things around social change? Are we going to seize these opportunities around, sort of what's happening on the globalization front, around things like inclusive capitalism to actually build a more equal world, not just on a gender basis, but across all dimensions? Or are we going to allow the structures that exist in some of those preconceptions really to define a worse future? And I think actually that part of the story is unwritten yet. I think that's what we really are here to try and write as we go forward.
Interesting. I'm thinking about, because you mentioned globalization. Gita, you've been talking a lot about sort of the challenges or the threat you've mentioned to this globalization part, and you've been sort of talking about that, of course, in the terms of the IMF and the economies of all this. How do you see things sort of from your perspective?
Okay, thank you, Anna. Firstly, I just want to say that this level of informality is awesome. and I hope as women we can make a pledge that as we get more leadership positions that we try to have this kind of an informal environment. That would be so fantastic. In terms of globalization, I mean, this is a major issue of our time. It's about, we've had several decades of economies being more integrated, free flow of ideas, multilateralism. And I think the last 2 years, for the first time, we've seen real reversals on those fronts. And we can put numbers to it. So for instance, if you think of what's happened with the US-China trade tensions, the IMF estimate is that that's likely to take off about 700 billion from world GDP by end 2020. Now that's the size of Switzerland's economy, right? So this is not just talk at this point. This is a real issue for the global economy. But what this tells us is that this is also a time for us to pay attention and fix the problems, because while there has been a reduction in global poverty, we have the issues that Jackie raised with rising inequality, with concentration of income and wealth in the top 1%. And these are real issues to deal with. And I'm just going to leave with two things that need to be done. One is, it's not just about international solutions and international cooperation. It has to do with domestic policies. I think at home, countries have not delivered on providing sufficient safety nets for their citizens, for recognizing the fact that people just don't simply get up and move to opportunity as we think that they would do in a seamless way. And so communities have to be, you have to focus on local policies too. And secondly, institutions have to adapt. I mean, we've had these institutions for a long time, the World Trade Organization, the multilateral system that we trade in. Those have to adapt with the reality that we face. And unfortunately, despite a lot of talk about it, there's really hasn't been much clear action on that front. So I think if we can fix those two issues, we can hope for a better future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gita. And I think it's really important, and this might be sort of because we're setting the scene for the coming days. I mean, the outlook of this conference is all around power together, as Silvana mentioned earlier. It's about talking amongst parliamentarians, among ministers. There is politics, and then the business and culture and media and what have you. So this sort of interaction between these groups, I think are super important. But I would like to draw our attention and maybe get your sort of reflection on that. I mean, this is 2019. And the World Economic Forum tells us that it will take around 207 years for us to get to a world of gender equality, meaning that we will never live it, our children will most likely not live it, and so on and so forth. And I mean, we see the figures. We see the figures in Parliament, 25% women. We see heads of state, 7.5% women. We see CEOs, as I mentioned earlier. Again and again, we're seeing these figures. And not only the figures, but we're seeing the perception as well. As will be introduced later today, we have the Reykjavik Leadership Index, where we show that the perception of the general public around the world is that women are less suited for leadership. So I would like to sort of reflect a bit on that, Julia. You have said that when a woman enters the stage of leadership, she is even dehumanized. This is the way you have phrased it. You've said yourself that the factor that you cannot explain in your career was the fact that you was a woman, so it was the gender factor. How can you sort of tell us a bit more about that? I mean, how can that reflect on the figures we're seeing?
Well, obviously my experiences are in Australian politics, but I spend a lot of time now talking to women around the world and working at King's College London at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and so I know that these are much more common experiences, and I want to make that point to start with because I think sometimes it's convenient for people to say this is all about Australia and it doesn't happen here. The reality is it happens everywhere. And what happens everywhere is if we look at the pathway to leadership, there are many obstacles strewn in a woman's path that are not there for a man. We tend to focus a lot on the balancing of work and family life, but that is not the only one. The very perception of what is merit, who is on the network for promotion, these things are also in women's way. And in politics, in business, a lot of these senses of what merit is, who deserves to be promoted, have come out of generations and generations of male power. So they're about a culture of presenteeism, being at the drinks after work, going with the other men to sporting events, getting on the network, making sure that there are the bonds. So we do have to address all of that, and I was conscious of that as I went through Australian politics, but didn't feel that was stopping me. What really hit me when I got to the ultimate top job of being Prime Minister of Australia was this issue of stereotyping. And I think we easily fall for a stereotype about leadership, that it's about, it's about confidence, it's about charisma, it's about command and control. And we fall for a stereotype of women that says that there are good women and bad women, and good women are the ones that reach out and look after each other, and bad women are the ones who are hungry for power and ambitious for self. And then when these two things collide, either you are too soft and fuzzy and, girly to have the top job, what's she doing there? Or you are exercising the levers of power, doing a lot of things that are associated with, the mechanisms of politics, and people look at it and say, gee, she's not very empathetic, she's not very nurturing, she's not very nice, and you pay a political price for that. And that's what happened to me. And if we're in that binary divide of women must be caring and sharing, putting others first, never ambitious for self equals good. Women who have power must be pretty self-centred equals bad, then I don't see how we can ever win this. And so that, I think, raises two questions. Question number one, can we reshape the stereotypes of women and men? Because lots of men are caring and sharing too. Not every woman should be expected to be caring and sharing. Some women will be command and control leaders. So can we diversify the images of leadership and the stereotypes of what men can do and what women can do? But can we also have the deeper conversation about what are we expecting of leadership in this modern age? And yes, there are still times for command and control style leadership, emergency management, there's a fire, there's a bomb, someone's got to respond, they will be command and control style structures because of the immediacy of it. But mostly in our societies today, I think people are looking for leadership that's different to that. And how do we actually get a shared sense of what good leadership looks like? And I think if we did that and debunk the stereotypes, then we'd create a much more fluid situation for more and more women to come through.
Thank you so much, and thanks for reflecting on that. This is the sort of, and Steingrímur mentioned this earlier today, that we are sort of maybe a bit fixed in recent years on talking about the perception of women in politics and that kind of leadership position, because we're used to seeing them on stage, and we would really like, for example, a different picture of the G20 where we can see one or two, so we're fixed on that. What about business? I mean, you are both in environment where, I mean, in politics there are still, I mean, there are few, but there are more than in sort of the senior leadership when it comes to especially a certain type of businesses. I mean, how is it with the environment you have been in? Do women become super tough, as he is explaining, or can they be themselves, either soft or strong, if you like? How do you perceive that, Jacqueline?
I mean, I think, I recognize very many of the things that Julia talks about, and I think very many women in business would recognize them as well. The sense of you need to be very nice, you need to be likable on the one hand, but if you're likable, then if you're not able to actually lead, you're not tough enough. And I think that dynamic plays through absolutely in every business environment I've ever been involved in. I'm a pragmatist at heart, so I don't think we should seek actually to make women all adopt a particular sort of characteristic,
Precisely,
to make them
yeah.
more like men, to make them more like type A, sort of command and control. Equally, I don't think we should seek to make all men, sort of caring. I think this is a question of how do we build corporates where actually you can bring the skills and the strengths that you have as an individual into that environment and for them to be used to their greatest effect. And all corporates, I mean, I'm in a large multinational, 70 countries, 142,000 people. There's no way that you could act in just one dimension and expect to be effective. You need to be able to, at least as a leadership team, if not as an individual, to exercise both empathy and an ability to be a visionary, both charisma and an ability to listen. So I think the corporate structure itself doesn't preclude us from making progress. I think it's our own conceptions and our own stereotypes. And I think it's easy for us to think this is about men stereotyping us, but actually, frankly, through my working career, I've seen it as much, maybe sometimes more, from women. Women who either hold themselves back and say, look, I don't want to be what it takes. And my argument is always you don't know what it takes because you get to actually influence that. You can become the leader you want to be and to live up to your values and to drive things in a different way. But also from those who say, look, I'm really pleased you're here, for example, because we have no female role models. And yet then I look around and I say, but there are lots of female role models. And the response I get is, well, that's not who I want to be. So I think we need to, both as men and women, stop trying to put people into boxes, saying, so-and-so is not like me, therefore I can't do what they are doing. I think there's certainly an opportunity to bring some of the softer sides, some of those skills in. I agree absolutely that not all women are empathetic, and I think, to me, it's a game of numbers. So I think if we get enough different people, and I use different in inverted commas because actually, it's not different in terms of the demographics. 50% of our populations are female. We are far more sort of diverse in terms of ethnicity, religious persuasion, sexual proclivities, all of these things than any of our corporates or our political spheres would indicate. But I think if you get enough people, then what you don't get is this idea of somebody representing womankind. And I do find that sometimes I'll be in a boardroom or at a big meeting and something comes up that has a female aspect to it, and all of my male colleagues and a lot of the women will look to me for my response. Now, I feel strongly and I want to push forward gender equality, but I can't represent every woman. And I think this is what happens if you have too few in positions of power, then they become emblematic of everything, and you get this kind of on-building of the stereotyping that you were talking about.
I think this is a really good point. I mean, you're saying, because I was going to ask you sort of a follow-up question, so you would say numbers matter, because I think when you're alone in the room again and again, or they are super few, so sort of the mass would matter. You would say that it's totally different to work in an environment where there isn't just one, there is like a group, and the diversity is there, not just when it comes to women and men, but diversity in general.
I think numbers matter for a couple of reasons. The one is there's lots of research that shows if there's only one woman in the room, in a board, for example, her voice often doesn't get heard. There's a lot of question about why. So if you have two or three, what you tend to have is people both more able to speak up, but also this ability to actually, sort of grow or amplify the voice. And there's some interesting research around that. I think they matter because I'm a big believer that actually diverse groups make much, much better decisions. And they make much better decisions because they bring different experiences and they force the group to talk about issues in a different way. If everybody comes from the same economic background, the same educational background, the same sort of social environment, the reality is they won't even see half the questions that are out there. So I'm a big believer that it brings better diversified and more robust discussion and decisions. Harder to manage, and sometimes it's easier just to have a, sort of a very heterogeneous group of people, but, I think that matters. And then the last thing I would say is that, I think numbers matter for the reason I said earlier, which is ultimately if you have a lot of individuals, if you have a CEO who happens to be a woman who fails in the eyes of investors, there is always this thought in the back of people's minds, see, I told you so, women can't be CEOs. if there were 50% of the CEOs being female, you just wouldn't have that dynamic at all.
Thanks for these important points, really important. And getting to you, Gita, I mean, you're in the environment where, I mean, the figures are sort of everywhere and everything is sort of explained with figures and numbers and so on. I mean, one could say the figures obviously show that we need gender equality. I mean, there is better growth in countries that respect gender equality. There is sort of every level of how people do better socially, the economies go better, people are even happier, wealthier, live longer, etc., etc., etc. This is everything showed by figures. Why is it then taking so long? And how is it for you to, I mean, you're young, you're in a totally different environment than we're used to seeing young women in. And I don't know, I shouldn't maybe say this. I saw the cutest video ever. It's YouTube, and it's her father talking about, it's her father praising her daughter in details, telling her life story and how super proud he is of you for making the choices you've made. So you must have had support and encouragement, at least looking at your father and hearing what he's saying. How is your sort of take on this? I mean, the figures and then your own life.
I mean, I think I like the line about that numbers matter, and I'm going to use it in a different way, which is, I mean, it's not just about that women should be in the workforce from a fairness or from a social perspective, but just from a pure economic perspective, right? And if you think of the big waves of economic reforms that have taken place over the last several decades, including globalization and what that has done for the global economy, a lot of that pales in comparison to our estimates of what it would mean if we had gender equality, if we had women's labor force participation at the level of men. So for instance, for the country that I come from, India, if there was gender equality, we would be talking about a higher income for the economy as a whole of about 25%, which is huge, which is way bigger than any of these reforms that we talk about on a daily basis doing. I mean, even for the US, it would increase it by 5%. In Japan, which has shrinking population, big questions about where growth will come from, it would be a 9% increase. So this is good economic policy and not just good social policy. So I think that that's an important thing for people to recognize. In terms of women and coming up to leadership position, I just want to bring in my personal background, which is from an emerging market, a developing country. And I think the difference it made to me was that because I grew up in one of those very few communities in India which are matriarchal, it was never a question that I would get a good education, that I would be sent to school, that I would get good medical attention, that I would have parents who would say that I was a worthy individual and somebody who could contribute. And I think that made all the difference, right? Because I used to go to school and I would meet my friends who were girls who would talk about how their parents did everything for the boy child and how their parents kept trying to have another kid who turned out to be a boy because that was so important for the family. And I came from a family where I had my aunts who were trying to have their third child because they wanted a girl. So, so that difference makes, it's huge. And so, while the issues that both Julia and Jackie raised about the work environment matters, in many parts of the world, it's some of these basic issues about access to education, access to health, and that can make a big difference to where women end up. And yes, like my father was in maybe a little too proud of me and embarrasses me in every possible way. But yes, it makes a huge difference having that support system where you have people who really think you're worthy and push you forward. And just one point I would like to add is that in terms of the perception of women, even now, you can be the most accomplished woman in the world and you could have all the right things on your resume, but you get a job and there will always be some people who say, oh, well, she got it because she was a woman. It's incredible. It's just incredible. And so I think the lesson to take away is just that you have to develop the inner belief in yourself because otherwise you would show up at work with people thinking, oh, she had an easy time getting this job. And the bottom line is that, what's what Julia said, we really have nothing to prove. God damn it, seriously. These jobs should have come to women many years ago. We absolutely deserve it, and I hope we will do this and pay this forward for other women in society.
Thank you so much. And just that I want to make sure that we stick on time, I want to end with, because we're setting the scene here. And here we are staying, a group of women leaders in Reykjavik, Iceland, talking about gender equality. And I'm thinking, we're sending a message to the future. We're sending a message to the girls that were like you were, and give my best to your father, so they can grow up and do what they want to do. So this is our sort of course, goal, to make sure that after we leave here, after 2 gorgeous days in Reykjavik, Iceland, we can come out and say we can do it, and we can even say to the girls of the future, you can do it, obviously. So if we just think about what we would like to see as the message, I mean, what would we like the outcome of all of this to be? I mean, Julia, what would you like to be able to say when you leave Reykjavik? And you said, oh, it was really, really encouraging and uplifting, and I can feel the spirit, and we can do it because of, what do we need?
Well, I think and it comes out of your comments. We need the perspective, not what would we say to a younger girl, it's really what world will that girl grow up in. And that's in our hands, in all of our collective hands, to create a world in which we can thrive. She can thrive. And it does start with education. And we do know that there are hundreds of millions of girls around the world who miss out on schooling right now. And then it is about how we create every aspect of our society so it's truly inclusive, including our own thinking about each other, that we aren't imposing stereotypes on each other. So I think what I would like to see come out of a forum is that shared commitment. I know everybody's come in wanting to change the world, but that shared commitment to creating that world and also doing it as quickly as possible. And the World Economic Forum statistics always put a chill down my spine. It's just, you know, at current rates of change, it's going to take too long. We do know how to change some things and have big impacts, but we still need more research, more evidence, more work to make sure that we've got the best possible toolkit to have the maximum amount of change. So let's build a world in which a girl can have a truly equal future, but that's not just an emotional or moral commitment, it's actually an intellectual commitment to the evidence, to making sure we have the best tools to bring the biggest amount of change in the shortest amount of time.
Have you felt, because you have been focusing a lot on the educational part, you've drawn that out of all of the aspects to sort of support and make the change. Why did you go into that? I mean, how was that sort of the area of choice for you?
Well, I am just conscious that, you know, my own life story is completely impossible if I didn't have a good education. And my parents were ordinary working people. I didn't go to an upmarket school. I didn't go to a private school. I went to the government school at the end of our street. And fortunately for me, that was a great school. If my parents had settled in a different suburb when they migrated to Australia, it might not have been a good school. And that lottery, whether you got into a good state school or a bad state school, kind of determined everything else about the rest of my life. I won that lottery. And so I didn't want, and still am passionate about, children around the world not facing that lottery, that every child, and particularly every girl, gets to have a great education. It's the foundation stone for everything else that will follow. And in terms of the economists and the benefits to our society, I think the evidence now about how transformative girls' education is on peace and development is crystal clear. But an underestimated part of it is the impact for climate change. Educated women choose to have fewer children. If every girl in the world today had a secondary education, peak global population would be 2 billion less than we are anticipating it to be. So this has got huge climate change dynamics as well. So, you know, it starts with educating a girl, and in my view, it ends with a woman leader.
Thank you so much for that. Jacqueline, I'm thinking the message to the future. I mean, in my work for UN Women and also for WPL, you sometimes become a bit gloomy because it's like, it's 25 years since Beijing and we haven't sort of gotten where we seriously wanted to be there, and there's a long way to go. How do we encourage them? How do we make sure that they don't sort of see it as an impossible task, but it's something that is sort of could be happening.
I mean, I think if you put it in a timeline that's much longer, you'll see that actually, while we're all personally frustrated at the pace of change, actually change has been pretty fast over the last 30 years. It's really not that long since there was actually pure suffragettes and emancipation. So, I'm not pessimistic. I'm frustrated and I'd like to be faster, but I'm certainly not pessimistic. I'm actually optimistic. And my message would be that to build the world that we want to see in the future, we shouldn't just focus on the role of women in that world. I think we have to focus on the world more broadly. I think we have to think about things like AI and what role is it going to play in our lives? How are we going to balance the ethics, for example, of sort of technological change versus privacy? How are we going to deal with the debate around the environment? How are we going to be more responsible and build a more sustainable future? How are we going to sort of engage in some of maybe the political and the trade and the tariff debates as women leaders? Because I think showing that actually we have a voice, we have a role to play in these issues that are impacting on every part of human life, I think shows what value we bring to the table. I think if we box ourselves too much into it just about being gender and not enough about, what solutions do we as women and as people of the community effectively bring into the world, then I think that makes it harder, not easier for us. So I would say go out, get engaged in your local communities. Communities are where everything starts. Those of you who have multinational or national powers, use those powers, use them to build the world you want to see. And I think that will then bring, pull up the sort of future for our daughters and other women as well.
Thank you so much. Gita, final words.
I mean, I would say that it's important to make people feel continuously uncomfortable about the current situation, right? We're doing a great job making people now feel uncomfortable about ignoring climate, inequality, but I think we need to make them feel really uncomfortable about ignoring where the progress you're making on women and gender equality. Let me give you simple examples. I know Iceland does this, which is gender budgeting, which just says, you talk the talk, well, show me, do you walk the talk? In terms of if I look at how much you're spending on women, what exactly are you doing for them? This is something, for instance, at the IMF that we're also paying very close attention to, that when we go and we do our surveillance of countries, that we will say, well, you obviously recognize there's a problem, but your solutions are way short of what needs to be done. We need to be absolutely making people uncomfortable of the fact that many women around the world, very large number of women around the world, live in unsafe environments. There's violence. It's difficult to get to work. It's difficult to get to school. And that's unacceptable. So I think if we, people want to ignore some of the problems that are around the world. If we can just be agitated about it all the time and make them feel uncomfortable about it so they have to respond to it, I feel that maybe we can hasten the pace of this change.
Thank you so much. We'll leave the discussion for this. Thank you so much. Thanks to these great three ladies. Thank you for setting the scene, and thank you for making sure that we're focused on the most important issue, and thank you for staying on time with me. Thank you so much.